So hello, good afternoon, everybody. I think it is just about 1:45. So I think we will start. Firstly, just excuse me, I've lost my voice, so I hope everybody online can hear me okay. If not, please just shout. Welcome to the March meeting of the authority, both everybody in the room and all those people online. We have a appointment from Christine Watson, and Tim is online in foreign climes somewhere. But otherwise, everybody's here. As usual, today's meeting is being recorded in the interest of transparency, and the recording will be placed on the HFEA website after the meeting. And welcome, obviously, to our external advisors, external observers. I'm not sure if we have any department advisors online. I don't think so. I think we have apologies from them. So firstly, declarations of interest, which I think firstly should be Peter.
Thank you, clinician and license holder in licensed clinic.
Thank you. Tim, I think.
Nothing to declare.
Nothing to declare. And Steve.
Thank you, Steve Troop. I'm a clinical embryologist and I provide consultancy advice to the fertility sector.
Thank you. Anya?
Freelance work in a fertility clinic.
Thank you. And anybody else? Catherine? Well, next to you. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Catherine Seddon, I've just joined the board of the HCPC, which is the Health and Care Professions Council, and I'm also going to be sitting on their Audit and Risk Assurance Committee.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? No. Okay, is it working?
Yep.
Yeah. Fine, sorry. Thank you very much. So now we go to the previous minutes of the previous meeting, the January meeting, and we received comments from a number of authority members, for which I'm very grateful. The minutes reflected your comments and were resent out. Is everyone happy that they are a record of proceedings and I can approve them, or any further comments? Everyone's happy, thank you. Minutes are approved. And matters arising are straightforward. Actually, I looked at matters arising, and I think, broadly speaking, they're either ongoing law reform, continuing our discussions with the department, or have been actioned or are dealt with on this at this meeting. So I think we can proceed to the Chair and Chief Executive's report. This, as everybody knows, is just a record of what Peter and I have been up to since the last meeting, and you'll see that in January, Peter and I attended the meeting of the ALB senior leaders meeting for all chairs and CEOs. That was really very interesting, we met some of the new chairs who've taken over from some of the ALBs and really had a discussion about the plans for the department going forward. And also that was the meeting at Mr. Streetington.
It is.
And the Secretary of State for Health joined us, talked about not only the 10-year plan for the NHS, but the government's agenda. And he was questioned quite robustly. And it was a very interesting discussion. He seems to be wanting to really make reforms in the sector, and was very open about his plans and intentions, and agreed to sort of keep in touch with the group as time went on. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that also shortly, tomorrow in fact, Peter and I will be meeting the Minister of Health, Baroness Meron, just to talk to her about our plans, the proposals for law reform. We've sent her a briefing on, and to discuss with her whether she has any questions on the proposals that we put forward, and how we can help her, if you like, to understand those proposals, and perhaps and some of our suggestions of how she can help us. I think that was it from me, Peter.
Thanks, Julia. I won't repeat the issues that Julia's covered, and nor you've got the full list there. I'm happy to take questions on any of them. I think a couple of things worth drawing out because they relate to recent authority discussions. Obviously, you'll know that in both November and January, you spent quite a lot of time talking about various scientific developments, 14-day rules, stem cell-based embryo models, and in vitro derived gametes, the latter of which generated quite a bit of press coverage, some of it rather sort of excited. And I think one of the issues about IVGs generally is that clearly this is a genuinely disruptive kind of technology, but it's not there yet. So there's, it's right and proper that we and other people are starting to talk about it, but one wants to do it in such a way that you don't give the impression that somehow or other this is a tomorrow's treatment option. And I think some of the coverage can be a bit like that. In that spirit, I was invited onto Radio 4's Today programme to talk about this, and indeed a couple of other people a bit later on in the programme also provided commentary. So my sense is, while the story has died down, we can expect more of this over time. It clearly is a subject of considerable public interest. Next thing I think is worth thinking about in the context of our strategy, you'll know that a big part of that is around better use of data, and that might include AI tools, but generally better use of data. You won't be surprised to know that we're not the only public body thinking actively about those things. I think some are further advanced than us and some are less. So, towards the end of February, I spoke at the annual conference of the Association of Chief Executives and Public Chairs Forum, with precisely on the use of public bodies' use of data technology and innovation, where there is clearly, as I say, a lot of work going on about how best to take this forward. I think the sort of consensuses that come around are that simply talking about AI in the abstract isn't very useful. It is clear that it has many uses, and actually public bodies are better off, I think, thinking about it as specific applications for specific purposes and making assessments on their usefulness on that basis, rather than simply airily talking about adopting AI. I don't think that's a terribly meaningful kind of summary on all of this. And I think longer term as well, and again, there's elements of this in our strategy that will force us to think, depending on the usefulness of these sorts of things, on, skills gaps and the like. And the other thing that came out strongly for me was a sense that, and this was somebody from Microsoft saying, basically, if you don't get to the place where you have decent, modern resilient systems with interoperable data, then talking about AI is putting the proverbial cart before the horse. That actually, you can't build and use AI tools on the basis of not very good quality data. And to that extent, I think the strategy we've adopted, where you'll know this year, having completed the sort of PRISM data submission program, we're now looking at the replacement to Epicenter, the system that allows us to manage all of our regulatory inspection and licensing data. That feels, I came away reassured that feels the right way round. That's the last of our old legacy systems. Get that into a place where we're on common platforms, which is around about 12 to 18 months piece of work, hopefully, then we can have a really serious conversation about how we might utilize particular AI applications. Because until we're in that place, we are really trying to run before we can walk, and we're unlikely to get the best out of that sort of system. And happy to take any questions about that. Lastly, towards the end of February, I and Rebecca, one of our scientific policy managers, had a meeting with the Regulatory Horizons Council. You may remember that in the paper on IVGs, we referenced there that the Regulatory Horizons Council were keen to do a piece of work on IVGs, and particularly about suitable regulatory models as part of a broader piece of work. And we've begun that conversation with the Horizons Council. We don't yet have a sort of worked out proposal from them, but as soon as we can put some sort of flesh on the bones of that, we'll obviously report back. And lastly, just to say, because this brief was submitted last week, the roundtable event on stem cell-based embryo models, which was to be hosted by the Nuffield Council and also involving the Minister, Baroness Meron, which was supposed to be Monday this week, had to be cancelled because of a ministerial diary clash. So nothing to report on that. And if that's a helpful summary, I'm very happy to take any questions or comments.
Any questions or comments on Peter from? Yep.
Thank you. So you may want to revisit this in one of the papers further on where you talked about when you were going to look at AI. I was going to raise an issue about the timing because from personal experience where I am working in a different organisation, there's the AI, which I think you're talking about at the moment, which is the how do we improve our wider systems and use the data. But then there's also the potential AI use within sort of policy, within producing briefings, within notes of minutes and other such things. And we're really being driven forward on that because people are actually just starting to use it, so taking control of it. So I was just going to ask about the timelines of that. And I think it does tie into your point. There are different types of AI that require different strategies. So I don't know if you want to take that later on when it's mentioned on the timelines or now.
You're right, Tom. And within the sort of government, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology have produced a series of sort of tools exactly like that. There's a sort of briefing one, and there's a number of these things. And I think what we need to do is find the time to have a look at some of those and see how useful they are. And I think one of the things, you know, there's almost an advantage here as well about not being absolutely first adopter. One of the other things I took from this conference was the sense in which I think one of the ways the public bodies may move forward on this is learning from each other about kind of what was useful. But you're right, there are a suite of applications from the government at the moment, and it doesn't require us to finish the epicenter work before we could kind of look at those sort of discrete applications. I think at the moment it's about finding time. I don't know, Claire, do you think there's anything to add on that?
Only that we are, excuse me, there are some tools that we have access to through government comms, for example. There's a GCS tool to support AI development of crisis comms plans, press releases, briefings. So I would say we're playing with it rather than using it to its full capacity at the moment. And what we found is it's very good if you have big spend marketing campaigns to kind of help you tailor those. We don't, but you know, you can see how over time it could become more useful. And we're also looking, should we have the money to invest in our website, of how you could use, you know, those sort of chatbot type tools where we know that we have a huge amount of information on our website that's very difficult to find. So actually having tools that would enable the public to type in a question and the answer kind of coming up with the web page that you're looking for would be a really time-saving and efficient way of using our website. So subject to funds, those are the sorts of things we would make more use of over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. So now we come to the committee chairs report. These are reports written by chairs of those committees that met since we met last time in January. Let's start with Statutory Approvals Committee and Francis. It's an update.
Thank you. So we've got a very detailed summary of the 3 meetings in December, January and February. You'll see from the minutes approved for December and January, we've approved most but not all of the applications for a licence for PGTM. And you'll also see that we've had 1 application for a treatment for pronuclear transfer in Newcastle to avoid maternally inherited mitochondrial disorder. And that was approved. We don't yet have the finalised minutes for the meeting that was held at the end of February.
Thank you. Catherine, AGC.
Thank you, Julia. We had a very interesting meeting in March, just last week. From external audit, we had an update on the progress with assessing the revenue risk arising from PRISM with respect to duplicate billings and associate refunds. And we discussed at length the potential significance of that risk and assessed the knock-on implications for the auditor's confidence in the accuracy of the accounts, which remain reliant on data from PRISM. And it's fair to say that the external auditors currently have a different view of the potential risk from that of the executive. But from the point of view of assurance to the authority, I can give you the assurance that AGC will keep under very close review. And it's also worth noting that the external auditors were at pains to say that HFEA colleagues are working extremely hard and openly with them in all their inquiries, and already that they've made significant progress. So I hope to give you better news in June. On internal audit, we've made good progress with the plan to the end of the year. And we were very pleased to approve the annual plan for 25-26. We went into some detail about further issues to resolve in the ways of working document between the HFEA and the internal auditors, and the need to socialise more widely across all colleagues, clarity about what's required by way of evidence to satisfy internal audit recommendations. There have been some further delays, again, to closure of long overdue internal audit recommendations, and we appreciate the reasons for those, including some that are out of our control. But we're still very keen to ensure that all outstanding recs are completed by the year end, so that we reach a steady state of routinely closing future recommendations within the agreed time limits. And again, I hope to be in a better position to report progress against that by June. On risk, Shabir presented an excellent outline of a zero-based review of our strategic risk register against the new 3-year plan. And we made a number of suggestions and look forward to seeing that fleshed out in June. And on functional standards, we were very pleased to see that the revised policy and outline of process improvements following a limited internal audit rating has now got assurance from the ALB oversight team as being both suitable and proportionate to an organisation of our size. And on PRISM, the progress to publication of the interim CAFCA and the full CAFCAs remains on track, and the 10 family automated alerts are working effectively. And last but not least, we had a very encouraging oral update from our new IT project manager for what's now called Project Phoenix, which is the name for the replacement of Epicenter. And we'll be receiving written reports on the delivery of that project at each AGC in the future. Very happy to take questions.
We'll move straight to Tim and take questions at the end. Tim, Chair of SCAC, Scientific Clinical Advances and Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Julia. So the minutes from the SCAC meeting held on the 3rd of February are published on the HFEA site for anyone interested, but there's also fairly detailed summary in today's papers. Essentially, we covered a number of topics, including health outcomes in children conceived by ART, the impact of stress on fertility treatment outcomes, had a discussion regarding mitochondrial donation and polar body transfer. We went through the prioritisation of horizon scanning topics in the committee work plan for the upcoming year. We continued with our add-ons work and reviewed androgen supplementation and gave ratings for DHEA and testosterone. We completed our annual effectiveness of the committee review. And then finally, just a final note is that we're currently recruiting 2 new external advisors to SCAC. The first being someone with an andrology or urology background with a focus on male fertility. And the second being someone with a background and expertise in AI, machine learning and big data in fertility treatment, or automation and robotics, or biostatistics and assessing the quality of research. And those applications are open until March the 16th. So I'd encourage anyone with any within their network to please spread the word. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you, everyone who's already given us a few names of potential candidates. And please, if there is anybody you can think of, please let us know. I think it shuts midnight this coming Sunday. So we've got just a few days left. I don't think there was a licence committee. You're meeting next week, aren't you, Graham? And I wondered if there was just anything you wanted to update.
Yes, there's very little to report, but I think there's only 2 things I wanted to say in the light of the fact we haven't had a meeting since last time. That is that the minutes have been approved of the meeting that we'd had before the last meeting, and you'll see here it says reserved decision in 2 of the major items. I just wanted to point out reserved decision doesn't mean indecision. It's a polite way of expressing the fact that we found ways within the constraints of the statutory framework that we've got, ways of trying to be as creative as possible in coming to the best judgments we can, using special directions and asking for further information and so on. So that's worth this pointing out. I think the second thing, because if you serve on the licence committee, you tend only to see the problems, the serious problems in clinics. It's very good now that we've got the executive licensing panels report here, which doesn't need a huge amount of report because of discussion, because it's about the number of clinics that work perfectly well within the framework, and it's a reminder here of just the sheer scale of those who do what they're asked to do rather than those who don't. So I think there's a lot to be said for the new presentation of our committee reports and the fuller way in which they're done. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. And I echo that. I really like that because it just gives you a snapshot of the different clinics, and it's sometimes we don't get into the detail of each clinic, so it's really helpful. Any questions for any of the committee chairs? For anybody else? So now we'll move on to our usual performance report. Everybody knows, just gives us a snapshot of the organisation since the last time the authority met. So why don't I hand over to you to introduce?
Thanks, Julia. There have been we're on a trend at the moment of generally meeting our KPIs, and performance of the organisation is good. We are typically missing 1 or 2 KPIs in particular months. Some of them are long-standing issues related to debt collection, which, although we're still missing the KPI, is genuinely improving. And other things are much more occasional, so they don't point to systematic issues. But the inspection reports, which no doubt Rachel can say more about, frequently involve simply a particular tricky report or something or other, where our view is it is better to do it right and miss a KPI than rush at something complicated for the sake of the KPI and pay for that later on, and with all sorts of other kind of issues. Couple of things worth drawing your attention to. So as I say, we've got a couple of red indicators at the moment. You'll also see this time we have increased the number of KPIs to 19. That's because there's 2 new ones on OTR, which I'll let Rachel explain a bit more about. But this is trying to respond to what I know were interest in the authority to have a slightly more granular sense of what's going on across the piece. And we'd very much welcome views if you think that's sort of doing it. On HR, again, if I can find the right charts. Sickness is still below target despite coming through the winter period, and turnover is now at just 6.5%, which is probably as low as I can remember. We set ourselves a target between 5 and 15%. I think actually, just given a couple of moves that are in the pipeline, that number will go back up again. But again, I think there's a huge difference between an organisation that through natural churn or people seeking promotion opportunities are moving on, and an organisation that's fundamentally struggling to, adequately and speedily, get the right staff resources. So for the moment, at least, turnover feels securely manageable within that kind of framework at the moment, and obviously far better than where for a while I was reporting to you turnovers of the sort of 20% range, which is much more problematic for an organisation of this size. So that's all I want to say by means of introduction, and I'm happy to take anything during the discussion, but I was going to hand over to Rachel to talk about her area.
Thank you. Yes, just to pick up on the inspections, as Peter's just described, we have KPIs as obviously a guide, and we do want to be able to meet those. But it is totally justified sometimes where we have complexities that we've found on inspection or incidents that we need to go back on. The inspectors very often are only on site for one day, and we need to do follow-ups with the people involved in the clinics or the PRs. That might be through further meetings, it might be through gathering further information to review, or we may have management review meetings, which involves myself and Sharon, the chief inspector. And it's totally justified because we need to do that, because we need to make sure that we have the right and correct information that goes into that report that the PR is in agreement with. So whilst it is a guide, we will always take our time to make sure we've got the right information to go into that report. So I'm not overly concerned when we do have one inspection report not meeting that KPI. Just to note on inspections, we've now got our full schedule for the next financial year. Currently, we've got 94 inspections booked in that year, probably average 7 to 8 a month. But it's important to note that that does change, and it's likely to increase because we do fit in extra inspections. For example, obviously new clinics that open, but also following incidents and whistleblowing allegations. So it is going to be quite a busy year for the inspection team. With respect to OTR, you can see that we do have the KPIs in there at the moment. It's different to how we produced them a few years ago, which was when we had just a time frame to respond to an application. Because we do have a waiting list, and because of that backlog that's there, what we felt it was more important to follow on is how we're getting down that backlog and getting the waiting list down and so applicants aren't waiting quite so long. And to do that, you obviously need to know the number of applications coming in to the number that we're closing. So overall, we are making headway on that backlog. We are reducing the number on the waiting list, and applicants are having a reduced time in waiting for that information that they receive. You can see that the number that we close to open depends on obviously how busy we are. Some months are incredibly busy. We tend to be busier just after Christmas, maybe some DNA tests maybe that go out, or just raising awareness of family over Christmas. I don't know. We do have months where it's higher than others. It's important to note that we do generally close off more than that we receive. When we have a dedicated team who can focus entirely on closing those applications and working on them, we do make a really good headway that month. But often, including in the last couple of months, there have been things which have taken some members of the team out, sort of defining new processes and working through scenarios and issues that we have on a wider area. So I think the team are working really hard. The current waiting list is 926. We are currently got 305 that we're working on in the system at the moment, which will be ready to go out shortly. And in the last 12 months, over 1,600 people have received a closed application, which I think is very positive. But we will continue to monitor it closely. At SMT, it's frequently discussed about resourcing, and we will monitor that over the next 12 months.
Questions for Rachel?
Thank you, Rachel. And I was obviously very pleased to see these KPIs. But on the waiting list, I wondered if you could say more about how you set on the figure of a reduction of 40 from the wait list per month, because unless my maths is wrong, I think that would indicate that we wouldn't actually be closing the waiting list for over 2 years. And given that we don't know what the increase in applications will be, but we suspect that it may well increase, and certainly over that time, I wonder how you made the decision not to set that KPI much higher so that we could, for example, anticipate trying to close the current waiting list within 6 months, simply in order to safeguard ourselves, protect ourselves, if that suspected increase in applications goes up quite steeply.
So as you know, we put new IT systems in last year, which saw an increase in efficiency and streamlining of the process. We've also increased the team from a team of 2 to 5 with help from the registered team as well. Training somebody within, even with the new system, is still timely. It's not as complex as it used to be. We did make somebody who was on a temporary contract permanent as well. We have to think of resourcing. And based on the average that we can close out a month, that target to reduce the waiting list, we felt that 40 was sensible at the moment. We can't suddenly say that we're going to close out 200 a month because we haven't got the resources and trained people in to do that. And we need to think about the applications coming in. And we have done modelling to show that what happens of the impact in 2008 when the law was changed for better access for legal parent for same-sex couples. So we are factoring this in, but we had to set a realistic KPI and a target at the moment. Identifiable donors and processing that is taking a little bit longer at the moment because we're checking with clinics, we're ensuring correct information is going out. That will improve in time and speed up. So we've got to be sensible to start with, and it's not, that waiting list is a shifting figure because obviously we've got that amount of people, but that amount of people changes every month because the top people go off. And as long as we're going in the right direction and reducing the amount of time people are waiting, I think we're going in the right direction, but we will keep a close eye on it in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions for Rachel? Okay. Yeah.
Thanks. Just a brief update from me this month, just to add to what's in the performance report. So media interest remains busy. So I don't think there has been a quiet day in our small press office, which is good because we are seen as the font of information and data on fertility treatments and outcomes. But there's also quite a lot of things that are difficult for us to answer. We saw particular spikes of interest following the media piece on the authority decision on IVGs, and also the kind of fly in the wall documentary of Katie Price's fertility journey, and a big interest in our social media post about success rates for fertility treatment in patients in older age groups. In terms of things upcoming, we're planning for our spring patient and professional organisation stakeholder groups. We will be publishing our the latest patient survey, which is something we do every 3 years, national patient survey at the end of this month. And then we are working on our annual flagship fertility trends publication for publication in June this year. We've also supported the department with various parliamentary questions and other inquiries. And I should mention and give credit to Geeta for a debate in a debate in Westminster Hall on women's health, where I know Geeta was credited with supporting that. We provided a briefing note, which is on our website, of data, particularly for a fertility interest, which one MP did use our data for. I think it was a great opportunity to flag the real deficit, I suppose, in focus on women's health. But the focus was mostly on things outside of fertility treatment. So it wasn't a big focus of the debate. I also wanted to thank Geeta, Alison, Steve and Tim for helping us with the posts that we did over the weekend for International Women's Day. So they chose 4 females within the fertility sector who had either inspired them personally or professionally, and that's shown a great lot of traction, as they say, for the wider blogs that are on our website, but also in the social media posts as well. So thank you very much for doing that. That's all from me.
Any questions for Claire? Yeah, you too.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. Thank you, Claire. It's been a busy time for your team. Hopefully, women's health side of things will be taken forward actively with the DHSC. But just to say, I have to congratulate the team for such good social media activity from the HFEA platform. It's been proactive, lots of educational bit as well as reactive, depending on what's happening. So well done to the team. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall take that back and pass it on. Thank you.
Anya.
Just looking at the breakdown of social media engagement, I can see that X has been universally fairly low in terms of engagement. Has there been any thought about migrating to other platforms at all?
So we're sort of constantly, on an ongoing basis, we monitor our social media engagement, and X is something we use to as a one-way channel. We don't engage with it. The government communications policy at the moment is not to withdraw from X. Some organisations are setting up on Blue Sky, others aren't. NICE have got quite an interesting pilot where they have a WhatsApp channel to kind of pump out information, which I can see for people who work in clinics might be something quite interesting that we might think about in future. So I think kind of at the moment we're following government advice on it. But we do see LinkedIn is the highest, fastest growing channel, but we're also particularly in recent weeks seeing quite a lot of engagement on Instagram. So the information we did following the Katie Price documentary and the one at the weekend actually on International Women's Day was very successful on Instagram.
Okay, so I think now we'll move to finance with handing over to Tom.
Thank you, Chair. So we're now in the last month of the financial year and gearing up for final accounts. So the finance team are very busy. At the end of February, we're forecasting an overspend of around £84,000. We've got a couple of provisions on the balance sheet that we'll need to reverse as part of the year-end accounts, and that should more than make up this this overspend. The first relates to aged debt. So the finance team have done a great job in reducing our levels of aged debt over the past year. And we ended last year with aged debt of around £265,000. It's now at around 130, and the vast majority of that relates to one particular clinic who we are working with closely to kind of slowly reduce their levels of debt. We also have a provision against refunds for duplicate activity invoices, which is the issue that Catherine related to that was discussed at AGC last week. We're working very closely with the NAO to make sure that we can clarify the accuracy of that income as well as we can. We think the majority of these refunds have been paid during the year, so we're just making sure that we've got the right evidence for NAO to clarify that in the annual accounts. And we'll keep working with them over the next couple of months. So that's it for 24-25. I've included the budget for 25-26 in the papers. The department confirmed at the end of January that our grant in aid for the year is going to be. I'm very pleased to say the department has agreed to fund all of our funding requests, which means that we'll be able to pay for the IT development without having to increase fees during the year. They've additionally provided some funding to cover some investments in cyber security and also some investments to the website that Claire mentioned before, which we're planning for at the moment. More generally, for the budget for next year, we're assuming pay growth of around 3.5%, but that's going to be determined by government later in the year, and inflation based on CPI inflation. There's going to be some small changes to staffing due to some internal restructuring, but not a huge amount of change. And this is all manageable within the budget that we have. The budget will be finalised. It's draft at the moment. It will be finalised once we've completed business planning. Are there any questions on the finances for this year or for the budget for next year?
No, other than just to say that. Oh, perfect.
Thank you. It was. Oh, sorry. Thanks. It was just. I think you've partially answered this, but on the KPI, which is sort of one of the two that's red, but it's the historic debt that you're dealing with. I was going to ask, is great that you've had the push, great that you've had that success in doing it, but is it sort of a continued, there's still that old debt that keeps on happening because we're not collecting it and so it's rolling along, or is it kind of one fixed set that once it's sorted it will be off the books and you'll be at the kind of high level for everything else, because you can't really tell from the information?
I think generally we're much improved in how we manage debt. We put a lot of work into it with the team to manage debt. There's one organisation that is a bit more difficult to collect debt from. We're doing that slowly in a measured way. It's going to bring their level of debt down hopefully over the next, it'll take some time, but we do have a plan with them.
Right. So what that means is that actually we're assured for this overall, it's just due to one specific thing and you have a plan to deal with that, but we should continue to expect that this will be red for a while you're sorting that. So we can take assurance from that we understand why it's red, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Karen, about spending, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, sorry, on the spending review. So Treasury are running the spending review process at the moment, and we're working with the department to clarify our financial plans for the 3 years from 2026-27. As the spending review really focuses on central government funding, that only relates to a fairly small proportion of our income that we get from grant and aid. We're putting bids together this week. So our core grant and aid in effect really relates to the opening the register team, because that's one area of funding that we can't fund through fees. Additionally, we'll put in some bids for further investment in things like cybersecurity, IT, and also into the website. But government funding is quite tight at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware. So we're not putting in. We're trying to put in small but strong bids.
Thank you. And presumably at the next authority meeting, there should be more of an update, or is that too soon?
I think that's too soon. I think the spending review process is probably going to complete in the summer. It's going to take some time, I think. Generally, spending reviews are kind of finalised and announced in the autumn and kind of announced at the autumn statement. I think the timetable feels a bit quicker this time, but we'll have to wait and see.
So just keep us informed and absolutely updated as and when. Thank you. Any questions, other questions for Tom? Thanks very much. That was all very good. Now we go to the draft business plan, which everybody's seen. In fact, we've all seen several drafts of it, so this shouldn't be new. I think we're now at the point where we can really approve it. But let's get Shabir, if you would like to take us through some of the important points.
Thank you, Chair. From the attached business plan, it has the activities section, which are the major pieces of work that we're planning for the next financial year. A lot of the work is clearly dependent on law reform work and any parliamentary time that we get for law reform work. That's going to impact certain business plan objectives that we have, which are highlighted in the plan itself. The Phoenix program is going to impact every part of the organization and take a considerable amount of resource all the way through for the next financial year and part of the following year as well. So those are the two main bits of work, along with the fees review work, which will start towards the end of this year for implementation over the following 2 years. So that's just a quick short summary.
Okay.
Questions?
So I think where we are, and actually sort of what we ask the authority to approve, is that we do have a list of activities which we have as our priorities. But of course, should the law reform, the proposals for law reform move forward towards royal assent, I guess, quicker than perhaps we thought, or within this year, we might clearly need to reprioritize some of those activities, because of course that will in itself become an area of priority work, which it isn't now. So what we don't want to do is approve a business plan now and then in a few months' time come back and say, well, actually we need to reprioritize. And what I think the executive also advised, I think is perhaps the sensible thing, is to approve the main, the key activities. So, for example, Epicenter, which has to be a key activity and a priority regardless of anything else, because otherwise we can't not be able to continue our business unless it on OTR. So there are a few things that we should just say are the main activities and approve those, and also the fact that we're going to look at this further over the coming months, and take a view on the priorities as and when, and maybe perhaps in the next few months we may have a little bit of a clearer idea of it.
Thank you. I don't disagree with this. I would just perhaps add that that this is the track if law reform is on the horizon. If law reform comes back with a absolute no, not going to happen, is that gap then not filled? Do we not then need to do a piece of work which says, as we don't have law reform, are there any of our big challenges which there might be another route that we could go down to do? So would that vacuum not be filled by doing that piece of work to say, we don't have law reform, but these three things we need to find another route to fix because they're so detrimental to our mission? Yeah,
quite possibly, but I think that is a discussion that we would want to have at the time. I don't think we could possibly have that discussion now, or I don't think it would be a good use of time to have that discussion now.
That's right, Julia, but Alex's general point is right. So, we believe there are some big, quite structural issues which are best tackled by law reform. To be clear, we can't tackle those, satisfactorily tackle those issues by law reform, without law reform. But I think you're right. If there's a firm no, then there is absolutely our intention to have a conversation about, well, what then, within the limited powers we've got, where can we make progress absent law reform? So I think that's the conversation to have. But you're right, Alex. What this is not about is just sort of ignoring those kind of concerns, but clearly our hands are quite firmly tied with less room for manoeuvre. But you're right, Alex, that's a conversation we'd want to have. I think the general point is just, and obviously, with or without law reform affects different parts of the organisation. So as Subir says, there's a whole lot of activities in there which we are doing regardless. Then, and by when we talk about law reform, we're talking about, should we get the agreement, should the government decide to introduce a bill in the next parliamentary session? So that's the one that would impact on this particular business year. And that would mean for some of our staff, you know, that would absolutely be their number one priority and be very little space for anything else. And we would generally look at the balance of work within the organisation. But I think we're unlikely to have clarity on that until the summer at the earliest, and possibly the autumn. So, you know, you can take it that the activities listed here are very much, you know, we'll be intending on doing as many of them as possible.
I think just to remind ourselves that, you know, the business plan is a sort of implementation tool strategy, and these activities, most or all of them, are really key to delivering strategy. But you know, a number of them anyway might be to some extent affected by law reform if we suddenly get a yes, for example. So we'd have to pivot, and if we get a no, we would have to pivot also, because the same holds true. A number of them will be affected by a no, and we're not going to know either of those yes, whether it's a yes or a no, maybe for some months yet. So I think what we're saying to the authority, it's better to approve those bits of the business plan that we have to do for the key priorities, with a view to also doing continuing work over the next few months to see whether any of those pivots or what pivots might be needed in the coming months. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah. Any Catherine, did you want to? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Full support for the list of activities on page 54, and I completely agree that clearly the question of a clear steer on the possibility of legislative reform is key. But I also think that it's absolutely right to highlight that we've got to take into account how much work might be needed as a result of the full publication of the 10-year health plan. And it does seem to me that the current mood music, absolutely focusing on patient protection, patient-centred regulation, is probably going to be a very useful lens or framework with which, in the event that we get legislative reform, we can refine down that list of desirables down to the absolute crux essentials.
Yes. Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. Any other? So I think we're happy to go along, Shabir, with that plan, and I guess we'll keep everybody updated. And to the extent there are updates in the May meeting, I think we should probably have this as an item in the May meeting, even if there's nothing to report other than just there's nothing to report, and keep it in focus. So once a year, and this is particularly for new colleagues who won't have been through this before, we review our governance arrangements to make sure that they are robust, and that we retain the highest standards of governance within both the authority board and the committees and the authority as a whole. That sometimes means just a change to some of the standing orders, quite often just technical changes to make things work, or as committees change and so on, to shift things around. So there are a couple of, we've done the review, and there are a couple of changes to standing orders that we need. You'll have seen in the papers, but I'll just let Alison just to introduce what she'd like us to do.
So, thank you, members. The report is on page 60 of your pack. I will take it as read, but I would just like to highlight that the purpose of this paper is to provide reassurance over the structures established by the authority, the effectiveness of the committees, the decisions taken by those committees, and to provide assurance that our activities are aligned with our statutory duties, responsibilities, and objectives. You will see that the feedback from the committees have been very positive, and that there are some recommendations from the committees regarding their work. Just to assure you that the relevant committee officer will work with their respective chair to implement these. There are just two small housekeeping changes proposed in standing orders. And in early February, you were issued with a notice of motion to amend the standing orders at this meeting. And the chair will formally ask you to vote on this later. Before I hand back to the chair, are there any questions on the report?
And I think, as you will have seen in the papers, given that there's been some concern about some of the other within other ALBs about the governance and so on, we thought it would be really important to benchmark ourselves against a high standard of effective governance, sure, to see whether there were any areas in which we could improve, because one can always improve. But I think, we've come out well, but we obviously clearly need to keep it under review and make sure we hold ourselves to the highest standards. So, Ali, you'd like us to approve the revisions to the standing orders, which people will have seen in the papers, are approved. Yep. Everybody, firstly, do you want me to go through them, or can we take them as read? Take them as read. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of nods for those online. I think they're read. So is all those in favour just sort of?
The HFEA standing officer, you have a majority.
Thank you so much. So I think it's approved. Thank you. And to the extent that there are any action points or suggestions coming out of our review, we will be passing those over to the committee chairs.
I just wanted to say how valuable it was. I don't know whether I've seen this before, to actually have all the committee effectiveness reports in a paper and the actions taken on them. Have we seen that before, or is that the first time and it's just sort of an accident that it's here? Or is that something that I've just forgotten that we've done in the past? Oh, sorry.
It is in a similar format to last year, where you have all of the recommendations from the committee. But this year we have improved the evidence of the actions that we are going to take. So we sort of provided you with more concrete information.
Well, simply to say, I think that's a great improvement, and thank you for that, because I think it is worth doing, and it helps us, I think, as an authority to enter the mind of some of the other committees as well, which I think is useful to us as a board. So I hope that might be repeated.
So we are actually running a bit early because this is just the business of our business this month is not as busy as in some months. And so I don't propose to have a break, except that our next item, multiple birth target, Annabelle, who's introducing it, is not here yet. Because we're early.
Should we take a quick 5 minutes and then we'll go?
We'll go and find her. Why don't we take a 5-minute break and be back here at just about 10 to. Thank you. Right, I think we can reconvene. I hope everybody can hear me better. I've moved. Apparently, I didn't know it, but my mic wasn't working. So, you've probably missed everything I had to say. It could be no bad thing. But anyway, I'll try again now. Now, multiple birth target. This is actually quite a nice conversation to have, actually, because it is prompted by the dramatic reduction in multiple births from IVF over the last decade. And it's been a real public policy success, I think. The target that was set by our predecessors was 10%. We have gone well below that to somewhere around 4%-ish. And we thought it would be really helpful to have a have a discussion about, you know, looking at the new real rate, whether what we should be doing, whether we should stay with the 10% target, whether we should do some work about a lower target, you know, what we can do with this information. But it starts off from a position, I think, of real success that is just worth acknowledging, because it's made an enormous difference to the health and safety of many of our patients in the last decade, who will have had safer births as a result of single embryo transfer. So I'm going to hand over to Annabelle, and apologies, Annabelle, for sort of throwing you in it a good half an hour earlier than you thought, but hopefully that's okay.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. I'm Annabelle. I'm the Regulatory Policy Manager. And as you can see, I'm here to talk about the next steps for the multiple births policy. So you'll all have seen the paper, so I don't want to take too much of your time going through all the background and the history of this policy, but I will quickly set the scene, I suppose, before going on to discuss the options. So multiple births was last discussed in an authority meeting in 2021. And at that point, members agreed to maintain the 10% target rate for the time being and to review it again in future. And I suppose that's the purpose of my paper today. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to 3 important points from the paper for context. So the first point, which Julia's already kindly set out, is that we have a long-standing policy of a multiple births target rate at 10%. However, the national average multiple birth rate has been below 10% for some time, and our latest figures from 2022 had it as low as ever at 4%. Second point is our limited enforcement powers in this area. Practices to reduce multiple births have been widely adopted in the fertility sector, but we have a limited range of tools to take direct regulatory action where a small number of clinics do have a high multiple birth rate. And the third and final thing I want to draw your attention to, and this is something you'll all be familiar with, is the possibility of upcoming law reform. As you'll all know, we published proposals for law reform towards the end of 2023, and this included that laws to protect patients should be strengthened. However, we don't have a sort of confirmation or a time frame for that yet. So I suppose all of that brings us to what I think are the key questions for today, which is this the right time to change the policy? And if so, how should we do that? Next slide, please. Oh, way ahead of me. So I'd be grateful for your thoughts on the options on the screen and in the paper. How I thought we'd structure the discussion today is I'll briefly introduce each option. I'll give a sort of high level look at the pros and cons, and then I'll give you an opportunity to discuss it. And then we can move on to the next option. And then when we've got through all 4 at the end, I'll be grateful for your decision on the right way forward.
Should we just hang on a second, Annabelle? We're going to just discuss, or do you think option by option?
Yes, we'll do option.
Yes.
I think we're proposing option by option, as Annabelle set out.
Okay, so
and then you can draw it together at the end, and we can decide the merits. But
yeah, so I think what we'll do is Annabelle will go give us a talk about each option. At the end of each option, if there are any specific questions about that option, not a general discussion, but about that option, then let's have those. And then at the end, then we can have a general discussion about deciding which option we like. Okay, does that sound good? Okay.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
So,
yes.
Just for clarity, when we talk about multiple birth rates, and I've gone to look at the state of the sector reports as well, just to be really clear, is that it looks like this is a multiple birth rate just in fresh transfers, or is it including all cycles, including fresh and frozen?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I can look into that and get back to you if that's helpful.
I think, I mean, Rachel might know, I don't know, but I think this is just from fresh transfers, because I know that there are some clinics around that have quite a low multiple birth rate from an HFEA perspective, because that's in the fresh transfers, but their multiple birth from frozen IVF transfers is above 10%. So I think we need to be really clear what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Peter.
Thank you, Julia. I think it was a really good point, Tim. I was going to also raise the point that with more freeze-alls happening, that is one way of reducing your multiple birth rate in fresh cycle because you're not doing a fresh transfer. And so to me, if we're addressing multiple birth policy, it's got to be fresh and frozen. Otherwise, we are just going to have this misleading or not meaningful data from fresh cycle alone.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Does anyone have any more questions before we move on to the first option? Doesn't look like it.
Sorry. Sorry, I've just checked with Amanda, who says it is fresh and frozen cycles. Does that help, Tim, as well?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think sorry, the wording needs to be changed then on the multiple birth reports. Because if you read it, it reads like it's just from fresh transfers. You know, the one where you look at the multiple birth rate over the years, the text underneath, to my reading, looks like it's just from fresh transfers, which I think it used to be.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We can make sure that the wording on that is clear. Unless anyone has any more comments on that point, should we move on to the first option? Thanks, Shabir. So the first option is business as usual until we have new powers. Hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. On the one hand, as we've said, this is a well-established and successful policy. And if we keep it the same for the time being, we don't run the risk of any work needing to be redone or relooked at should there be law reform. I suppose on the other hand, as I said, the national average multiple birth rate is well below 10%, has been for some time. And stakeholder feedback, stakeholder work that we've done indicates that the sector is ready for change. So I'd be grateful for your thoughts and comments on that option.
Anya.
Can you tell me a little now? Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the views from the stakeholders about why it's time for change? Can you just address that a little bit further?
Yeah, of course. I think it was a few things. I think, and there were sort of differing views about the right approach, which I can get onto a bit later. But I think the main thing was that the multiple birth policy has been really successful and it's done a lot of work over the years, but we can kind of build on that given that, you know, we've got an national average multiple birth rate which is so much lower than 10%, that that 10% figure doesn't necessarily reflect what's really happening in the sector at the moment.
Yeah.
So I've got my hand up as well, but I'm not.
I mean, and the thing that troubles me about this is that 10% was quite an ambitious figure when it was set, given what the multiple birth rates were. And there's something perverse about us having a target which is so far above what the majority of clinics manage to achieve. So I'm not very content with just leaving it as it is in the hope that there will be law reform at some stage, because it just feels to me as if this is something on which we could take some action now. And if we're not careful, we'll become completely unable to move on anything waiting for law reform. So it just seems to me to be a target that suggests now that 10% is acceptable, and that I suspect isn't particularly acceptable given the levels that have been achieved in so many clinics and which ought to be achieved. So there's something about this. I understand it's best to leave things as they are when you can't, when you can't do exactly what you would want. But I think to leave things as they are in option one is disadvantageous to our reputation, given that we're setting a target which is overshot and which seems inappropriate.
Peter.
Thank you, Julia. Agree with what Graham said. To me, it's not an option at all to leave it at that level for a number of reasons. First of all, yes, multiple birth is the single biggest risk of IVF treatment, but it also happens to be the single biggest success story in recent times from the regulator. It's been really such a good story with that campaign, one at a time, that we have achieved. The national multiple birth rate is far lower than that when we look at it. So 10% is a lot more than what happens naturally. And it is the risk to the mother, risk to the baby, they are quite high. So from the point of view of HFEA's position, the fact that we're addressing safety of the patient, the offspring, and the family, and the nation, to be honest, in some ways, because it does affect many more people than just families. But more importantly, we have actually made a commitment to addressing safety and also in some ways protecting public purse, because there's a huge amount of money, National Health Service money, because clinics don't take care of mothers and babies. It eventually goes to the National Health Service, and it costs more than £1,000 to look after, an ICU beds, and then there are so many indirect costs to parents on top of that. So I think this is a great message from the HFEA, and we have made advances in clinical protocols. Since this was established, this target was set, where there have been advances in quality in laboratory. To me, this is the right time. We cannot leave it at this stage, and we really need to lower that, and we'll come to that later.
Tim.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I know when we discussed this back in 2021, there was a concern that whilst 10%, I wasn't part of that original discussion, but clearly there was a few years ago a view that 10% was the right target to aim for, and I agree with Graham, that was certainly an ambitious target at the time that we reached within the sector relatively quickly, I would say. The discussion we had in 2021, which I think is still valid now, is I would struggle just to choose a further target to drop it down to without also having concerns that could affect the success rate for some patients. Because I think all clinics in some patients will look at putting 2 embryos back for whatever reason to try and increase the success rate in that cycle. Obviously, the downside of that, the flip side, is that risk of multiple birth that comes with it. But I would just be concerned about, well, what figure do we come up with? It's not a back of an envelope figure. There will be a point, and this is why we didn't choose a figure back in 2021. There will be a point at which the success rate for a particular patient would be affected. If, say, you chose 5%, is that the right or wrong answer? I don't know.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the majority of comments that have been made. I think that the 10% has come to its end of its useful life, and that people are so far under it. And it seems to me this is a target where everyone is, notwithstanding the clinical issues Tim has mentioned, everyone is pulling in the same direction. So I'm not advocating simply removing a target, but I don't think we would start to see that creeping up. It's not like, 4-hour A&E waits, everyone gets admitted at 3 hours 59, and if that became 4.5 hours, everyone would get admitted at 4 hours 29 minutes. So I think, just to leave it where it is, suddenly it's not a target at all, really. I'll make some comments in other options about how we might set another target to respond to swim, but that would be my view.
Francis.
So there's obviously significant range amongst all the clinics. The vast majority have been hugely successful at decreasing their multiple birth rate, and that doesn't preclude them for certain specific patients to deliberately put 2 embryos back because they think for that patient the chance of success is so small with a single embryo. So I was concerned to see that there are 6 clinics in the 10 to 15% range and 3 that have a multiple birth rate of greater than 20%. So it does sound as if there are some clinics that are simply not aiming for the target we have. Personally, I would favour reducing the target. And I think it could be done in such a way that doesn't have a negative effect on patients who have a very poor prognosis, but that would on balance still continue to improve the overall success of this programme nationally, particularly because we need to find a way to address these 9 clinic outliers who are offering a clinically unsafe service. When we look at the other options, we can consider the best way of doing that.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. But Alison and then Steve.
Thank you. Just sticking to option 1, the business as usual. I think we've moved away from business as usual. 10% was hugely ambitious, and it's brilliant that 4% is now acceptable, and the pregnancy rate still rises. I think that's the key message that we have to focus on, that reducing the number of embryos has not reduced the pregnancy rate, which was a great concern all those years ago when we started this. So I think now the business as usual, we've moved on from there. So for me, this is not an option.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating problem, and particularly for someone like me, with others around the table who worked through this, to within a clinic to bring it to fruition, and it was immensely rewarding to do that. I'm not sure that business as usual is the right thing to do at the moment, but I'm also not sure that changing the 10% level is the way forward, because it strikes me, and indeed in the data presented in the papers, 2/3 of the clinics are already getting less than 6% pregnancy rates, and that's with a target at 10%. So I think this is rather more to do with the attitude, as Francis has mentioned, perhaps the attitude within clinics, rather than the 10% rate per se, or rather than any rate per se. So I know we'll come on to the other options in a second, but I'm wondering whether less emphasis on a target value and more emphasis on somehow dealing with the clinics that aren't meeting whatever that target is set at might be the way forward here.
Say that and
Afraid. Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, I think I'm in the minority here in preferring this option. But just as a point of information, I think the table on page 75, the percentages are not listed correctly. Is that correct? It should be under 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6. The table on page 75.
If they're incorrect, they're only incorrect by a point.
No, but did you see the table? Like so the listing should say under 2, 2 to 4, not 1 to 4, not 1 to 6. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry, I've misread it. Yeah. But my reason for preferring this option is because I think, so thinking in a sort of strategic and rounded way, and the fact that we have limited resources, lots of things to do, this obviously is a success story and it's working really well. And it does seem that around 2/3 of all clinics are under that 6%, which is much lower than the 10. Then I think it just seems like the wrong place to expend further resources in an area that's already doing well. And I think whether we lower that limit or not at this point without any additional regulatory powers or anything at our disposal, I don't see how that's going to make an impact on the clinics who are already over 10%, who are the ones we really want to be dealing with. So I would go for option 1.
Tom.
Thank you. So it was just a couple of questions for me, really. So one of the major reasons for wanting to go with this option is the point made about the resources to come up with a new proposal, which I think ties into your point as well. But what I was sort of unsure or wanted a view on was presumably the major area of the resources is actually working out what the new threshold should be if you were doing it. And wouldn't that apply to all of these options? And therefore, the issue is when we expend that resource to do that, rather than that being a particular benefit of this one. And also, I did just want to, and again, I would sort of defer perhaps to people who are more used to this. If we were going to assume that we wanted regulatory reform to address this, would it not be easier to have it at a level that we would want it for that regulatory reform to move to, rather than saying in the regulatory reform we want to move down to that? Because it's easier to say this is kind of the current standard and therefore we're moving it across to address these outstanding issues. And again, that's perhaps my lack of experience in how this works, but strategically, basically what I'm asking is, are we better to get that in place so that we can do these things around regulatory reform?
It's a good question. I think hold that thought. I think what we should now do is go through to the next option, because there'll be a bit of drawing it together. But just to the point that Zainab and actually Tom is making, yes, we have concerns over the number, the smaller number of clinics who are over 10% and who are really causing the problem. But of course, without regulatory reform, we at the moment, at this precise moment, we have absolutely no legal or real economic even powers to sanction them. We can only just sort of slap them on the wrist and they can ignore us, which they are currently doing. So that's worth holding in mind. Claire, and then we'll move on.
Just to say something about the resources, because I think this reads across to all the options. So if the authority agreed to reduce the target, maths not being my strong point, but I'm sure there's a clever formula that we could come up with that would mean that, given that the national rate is 4%, that it wouldn't be particularly challenging for the vast majority of clinics. I think, as it's said in the paper, we would want to carry out an equality impact assessment, because we know that on certain groups, particularly with Black patients, there's a higher multiple birth rate. So we don't want an unintended consequence of a lower rate, meaning that some groups are more disadvantaged by a policy. So we'd have to come up with a number. We would, I think, expect to consult on that with both the sector and patients, given that this has been achieved primarily, it was very much driven by the HFEA, but driven by clinic staff and the professional bodies who really led on that. So I don't want to kind of downplay our role, but it was really down to the hard work in clinics that this has been a success, supported by the HFEA. So we would want to consult on that. And that has obviously resource implications. And then following any agreement of whatever that new number is, we would need to update our guidance materials, which are in the Code of Practice, general directions. So there's kind of some sort of regulatory tools that would need to be updated. And we then need to work out what inspectors are going to inspect against. At the moment, they inspect that there's a multiple birth minimisation strategy and that the clinic is within the 10% target. Obviously, a new target, we'd need to work out, what inspectors are looking at and how much of a focus we want them to kind of spend on it. And then lastly, once all that's worked out, we'd need to work out how we report on it. So in inspection reports, what we do by reporting kind of when it's not met, and of course communications for patients. So one of the bits of stakeholder feedback that I think is in here is that this is sort of the number 10 is widely understood. And though some patients are very keen to perhaps select areas where they may be more likely to have a multiple birth, it's very easy to explain and patients understand it. So there would be then a communications exercise both with clinics and with patients about why it's, I make up a number, 6% or 6.5% or 7%. So I suppose those are the steps if we did lower it or move to something else that we would need to take. Now, none of those are insurmountable. They're pretty much the same steps we'd need to take for whatever option we went through.
Annabelle, keep going.
Thanks very much for that, Claire, and thanks everyone for your questions and comments. So I think we're ready for option number 2. Thanks, Shabir. In a similar way to option 1, we could leave the rate at 10% for now, but change inspection reports to report multiple births only by exception where clinics exceed the 10% rate. In a similar way to option 1, this is a well-established and successful policy. But this option has the benefit of making changes, but without making a complete change to the policy if we don't feel that now is the right time for that. But on the other hand, in the same way as option one, there's a discussion to be had about how relevant a target far above the actual national average multiple birth rate really is. So I'll be grateful for any thoughts on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. One thing I wanted to ask was if we were to adopt option 2, am I right in thinking that that reporting by exception would form part of the Kafka publication, full Kafka publication, therefore that patients would have access both to the headline data on multiple birth rates, but also some indications or narrative with it about why that was a concern for us?
I think the reporting by exception more refers to where in every inspection report, which is currently paused because of PRISM, but traditionally every inspection report had headline rates of multiple births, and then would say, you know, this is below the target at 2% or above the target. So I think this suggestion implies that once we put that back in inspection reports over the next few months, once the Kafka verification takes place, we just wouldn't put that if it's below the target, but it would say this clinic's multiple birth rates above. I don't think it affects the multiple birth rate on the Kafka publication, which would remain the same, Peter.
That's what we'd intended, but clearly you could follow through that argument if you wanted to do it differently. But it's trying to turn the idea on its head, which sort of says most of the sector is in the right place. Let's reward them with no particular regulatory oversight on that, and we will instead draw the attention to the outliers. You know, how far you want in communication terms to follow that through, I think is an open question.
May I follow up?
Anya?
No, just follow up on that. Sure. Thank you. That was really helpful. I wonder whether I could ask a further question, which is, if we wanted, or if we were minded to extend this option and to say that let's do something more to highlight what we draw attention to if we were to adopt this option, how resource intensive would that be? Because at the moment, option 2 is presented as one of its pro arguments that it's minimally resource intensive.
I think it is minimally resource intensive as envisaged, because at the moment we are looking toward what data we put back in inspection reports following PRISM or Kafka verification. So as there's nothing in there, we can then have a discussion about what's put back. In terms of how we communicate any outliers, I think that would be subject to a further authority discussion based on the kind of historic decisions authority took about not having the multiple birth rates a license condition, and you know where the authority wants to perhaps, you know, do social media posts or newspaper articles or not on the outliers. I think that we'd have to come back with kind of communications options to the authority.
I think picking up on what's just been said, actually, it would be useful that any public facing, so either on the website or, you know, any headlines that patients are seeing, where it's highlighting, if we were opting to highlight a clinic that hadn't met targets, that was clearly stated as, you know, something to improve rather than a benefit for patients. I'm sure the majority of patients have also, similarly to clinics, got their heads around the advantages of one at a time, but there still will be some patients, I'm sure, that see multiples as a bonus. And so I think it's useful that we're really clear, if we do put a headline up, that we're explaining why the 10% is there.
Alison. Thank you. So for option 2, I think this is perhaps the one I would end up landing on, primarily because from a stakeholder point of view, as we've highlighted, it's accepted to reduce your multiple pregnancies for most centres. So much so, and Rachel just reminded me that at BFS, we're not updating the policy and practice paper on multiple pregnancy. It hasn't been updated since quite some time because it's accepted that that's what should happen in centres. The outliers we cannot do much about, unfortunately, until we get law reform. I think what we can do, though, is highlight the negative impact of multiple pregnancy in those centres that have a high multiple pregnancy, which is very similar to what we did first time round, when we took lots of time to speak to patients about 2, 3, 4 and more, I think was one of the books that we used to use. And the way that we can report it, obviously we have to be very careful with words, how that is reported, but that it's reported and highlighted in those centres only, and those compliance centres, there needs no mention of multiple pregnancy because they're meeting target. I think that would be quite a piece of work for us to find out what words we could use, whether it's in big red bold writing as perhaps some of us might wish. But I think it follows on what Annie's saying, that we have to make it that it's a negative outcome of treatment for both the clinics that are doing it and the patients. Because backlash when we did move to one embryo at a time were very angry patients because they just didn't accept that we weren't reducing the pregnancy rate. So I think we come back again to say that we didn't reduce the pregnancy rate. The pregnancy rate is increasing. So I think we've got a very positive message that we need to bring in, that there is no need to be transferring more than one embryo at a time. So that would be where I would like us to work on, and that keeps our resources to minimal if possible, while still sending out a very clear message. And I think that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Rosamond, and then Tom, sorry.
Yes. So I think it's good that we're working through the options in this way. I think the first thing I wanted to say was I don't feel enormously comfortable about staying with option 1. It's been such a success story, and I'd like to sort of credit again Peter Brody, and that report's been such an enormously influential thing and such a success story, as we're all saying. Just a point of information, if you like, now about option 2. Is there a way, given the resource implication issues that we're a bit worried about, also given at the moment the fact that we don't have law reform, we don't know when it'll be, would there be a way of presenting this as a sort of interim measure, as a sort of, I hesitate to use the word warning to the sector, but if one looks at that table on page 75, there are still about 25% of clinics that are above the between 6 and 10%, which is a lot. And then, of course, that doesn't even take into account the 10 to 15%. So could this be presented as sort of on a journey towards something else in the future, rather than that that we would revisit this in a more timely fashion than, was it 4 years ago, essentially, that this was looked at? Yeah. Anyway, just a question really at this stage about option 2. Yeah, thank you.
So that's definitely a thought, and let's hold that thought until we've heard all the options. Tom.
Thank you. Again, just a kind of a clarification question to make sure that I understand. So it looks like all of the other options are mutually exclusive, but this one is one that could be implemented regardless of the other options that we would go for, because if you reduced it to 5%, you could still take this approach with the 5%. So I just wanted to make sure that I understood. So we could actually potentially decide to do this and one of the other options as well.
Exactly the point, yeah.
Thank you.
That actually ties in very nicely with Rosamond's point, actually, so it's well made. Okay, let's, I think, now go to option 3.
Thank you very much. So option 3, we could find a new lower figure for the target. So this was a generally popular option with stakeholders that we spoke to, on the basis that having a target is a well understood policy, and even if we lowered the target, would be keeping that same sort of messaging, and that from that perspective would be sort of more straightforward to implement in the sector. I think on the other hand, there's a question about whether this would be effective to address centres with a higher multiple birth rate. And as I've already said, whether this is the right time to make a change in the context of law reform. So thank you. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that one.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Annabelle. I am in favor of this option. I really believe we have an opportunity now when we're discussing multiple births target to consider this. Resource implications I understand, but I think it's well worth that money spent because it will actually save money to the National Health Service if we more clinics started working on reducing their targets. I understand that we don't have any enforcement powers at the moment, but as Tom said earlier, it's a good preparatory work. It sends strong message to the sector and to the government about the commitment from the HFEA about addressing safety. And we can, I mean, there are a number of things that you can, I mean, with the 10-year plan and all that, there are a number of points that it will fall under. So in some ways, I think this is a good time to address this, to lower the target. Yes, some of the work needs to be done, but I think it's well worth it. And it will probably help when the law reform comes along that this preparatory work has already been done. I'm sure further commitment from the Thank you.
I just would like myself to make a comment, which is I'm not sure that just lowering the target would save the health service money or encourage clinics to reduce their multiple birth rates, those that are already below the target, because we know that those that are already below the target are really doing it. I'm not saying we shouldn't lower the rate, but they don't need additional incentives because most of them have reduced it quite considerably. The problem is that we know that those clinics who are outliers, who are above the target, having a target has made no difference to them. They're ignoring us because without any powers, there's nothing we can do. So I don't think we should be under an illusion that lowering the target at this moment will have any effect in terms of, significantly being another step to reduce multiple births even further. It might, but I think history sort of, as it were, has told us that that's actually not going to be the issue. There are other arguments which people have raised for lowering the rate, but it might be that it is a two-step process. I don't know. I mean, I think we need to think about it, but I think we need to just be careful. We need to be careful, in my view, deciding to go for a lower rate, which might not actually bring the birth rate down anymore, the multiple birth rate down anymore, because it's already doing well in those clinics that are taking notice of what we're saying, versus the resource implications of consultation and so on and so forth. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I think we need to be clear, which will mean we'll have to deprioritize something else. We've just looked at the business plan. We need to be clear that if we go for lowering the rate, something in that business plan almost certainly will have to go. So it might be a timing thing that we, if we move a bit further towards law reform, I don't know. But anyway, we can talk about that later. Josena. Oh, and Alison.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And I was thinking actually along exactly the same lines. And if we just again look at that table and we divide the clinics into two groups, we've got 72 of the 80 clinics who we can sort of classify as, whatever is the right word, compliant with the maximum 10% or 10% target, and 6 clinics, so 74 who are under that and 6 who are over it. And it would seem to me that it really depends what our ultimate goal is. Is our ultimate goal to address those clinics who are under 10%, but in the higher percentage, so maybe 7 to 10, and get them below 7 or below 6, in which case lowering the target might have some kind of impact on those clinics, because clearly these are clinics who are interested in, meeting the targets we set, etc. But if actually our ultimate goal is to address the clinics who are in that higher end, 10 to 15%, who are already over the 10 target, then it doesn't seem that there's a particular logic to think that lowering the target is going to have any impact on them, in which case I sort of feel like lowering the target might be perceived as over-regulation on clinics who are already being compliant and responsible. And I think Tim's point about trusting clinicians to make clinical decisions at their discretion within parameters that we've outlined sends a really good message to those compliant clinics. And I certainly wouldn't want it to look, particularly at a time when we have such resource, so many different things that we could really usefully be directing our resources at, that we're directing them at an area that could almost be argued as, overreach.
Alison, sorry. Alison and then Tim, I see you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with the points that Zainab raised there. This would be a huge piece of work when we're trying to target 6 clinics that are paying absolutely no attention to what's been advised at this moment in time. Lowering the target rate is something we could look at in the future with law reform, and if we do not get law reform, then it's perhaps a project we need to build in somewhere. But without any powers to deal with these clinics that are not compliant, I think this would be a huge piece of work undertaken with no real gain. Thank you.
Tim.
I agree with the last 2 comments, really, and it's sort of what I said at the beginning. If we, choosing a rate, we wouldn't be coming up with a figure here now. I would hope it would be a lot of work, as has been mentioned, a significant amount of work to come up with a lot of mathematical modelling about at what level there would be an impact. Because if you set 1%, for example, that there will be an impact on live birth rates for patients. So it is a sliding scale. You choose a figure, and there isn't a cause and effect. I'm currently abroad at a meeting, and people were talking about this last night. And some of you may or may not be aware that in the States, the way that American clinics have reached a low multiple birth rate is by using PGTA, so genetic testing of embryos, which obviously is red on our system, on the add-on system. So, but all American REIs, fertility specialists, will say to their patients and to others, this is how they achieve a low multiple birth rate, is by using routinely 70, 80, 90% PGTA rates across American IVF clinics. And there are UK clinics who are using PGTA or saying they're using PGTA as a benefit of driving down the multiple birth rate, because rather than putting 2 unbiopsied embryos back, particularly, for instance, in a 39-year-old, you can or a 40-year-old where the live birth rate per embryo, age 40, is about 10 to 15%. If you do PGTA, you can drive that up. But we rate it red, which is I believe is the right thing. So there would be an unintended consequence if we're not careful with lowering the number down of also giving clinics a reason to use more PGTA for that. The second comment is if we drop the rate, I promise you clinics are going to go, well, so what? What are you doing about the clinics that are currently running at 15%? What does this mean? This is another example of the HFEA really having no bite at the moment. I take Tom's comment earlier that, well, maybe it's better to have to choose a figure now, but I think the response from the sector will be, well, we're already, from the responsible sector, already driving this down anyway, and you're not doing anything about clinics with a high rate at the moment. So my sort of feeling is that as a message, yes, I can understand why you'd want to have a lower number, but it's a lot of work to get to something that is sort of happening anyway around the world. It's not just driven by the HFEA. Around the world, rates are dropping. There's a flip side of PGTA being used as an excuse as well. So I'm not overly keen on this option.
Thanks, Tim. Tom, and then Francis. Oh, you didn't know nothing, Francis.
So at some point, I think we're going to end up doing the work to try and decide what the new figure should be. And I wonder if we're deluding ourselves and kicking the can down the road and saying, oh, well, when we've got law reform, we'll do the work then. Because when law reform is upon us, I suspect we'll be busier than ever. So I do wonder whether it might actually be better to do that piece of work now. And in that way, also give a signal to the centres that that is the direction as travel, and we anticipate that in due course we will have greater powers, hopefully. And as and when we do, we really will be pursuing this. And whilst there might be the odd patient who potentially could benefit from multiple embryo transfer. It's a set of scales, isn't it? We've got to remember that every time we create a multiple pregnancy, we're increasing the chance of premature birth, consequences such as cerebral palsy and so on. And I think the downstream consequences are not always acknowledged by the clinics that blindly carry on with these unacceptably high multiple birth rates.
Geeta and then Zainab. I agree with what
Geeta, microphone.
Can you hear me now? I agree with what Francis said. I think with this work will have to be done and at some stage anyway, and I think this is good opportunity to get this work done. There will be quality impact assessment work done, all that necessary work that would be done, and whether when it comes to reporting option, whether we could consider by exception is something to discuss. But I still believe it's an opportunity for us not to be missed now. Julia, you said it's not going to probably reduce the cost of the National Health Service. But I think it sends a message if it came from the regulator that now we're looking at this new target. And that will, I think that's likely to reduce that figure, even from clinics that are not currently complying with the target. That's why I prefer this option. Thank you.
I actually wonder whether keeping it business as usual at this point in time is kicking the can down the road. I don't feel it is, because I feel that if we were to get regulatory change and more powers, wouldn't we want to direct those powers at sanctioning clinics that are over the 10%, rather than trying to do whatever with clinics that are somewhere between 6 and 10%? So I feel like if we get regulatory change and a range of appropriate powers, then it would be quite appropriate if the limit's still at 10%, and then we could think about how do we want to deal with clinics that are over that 10%. But I'm not sure that it's necessary at any point to change that 10%. I think the message is clear to the clinics who are, the choir has got the message and they are lowering it anyway.
Claire, then Graham.
Yeah, I think just a point of clarity in relation to kind of how any future law reform might affect this, and whether we are kind of kicking the can, as someone suggested, or not. So I suppose the areas of law reform, the law reform proposals that we published in November 2023 that would impact on this is, one is a wider duty on patient protection, both for the HFEA and for clinics, where one could argue in either relation, for example, to treatment add-ons or multiple births, that the patient's best interests were not being considered. And the second would be in relation to kind of those wider discussions about fines and powers, where you may find kind of types of non-compliances, for example, relating to multiple births, are not sufficient to suspend or revoke a license now, but may be more appropriate either for a financial penalty or a written warning or another type of regulatory tool which we don't have access to at the moment. So I'm not sure that we would be kicking the can down the road on a particular discussion about the multiple birth rate. Should we have those powers tomorrow, the authority would want to have detailed discussions about how the compliance and enforcement policy would change, how licence committee would interpret those powers in different scenarios, when it would be legally appropriate to use any of those new powers. So I think multiple births would become an example rather than kind of a main focus area of work, if that makes sense. So I'm not sure the target would necessarily be reviewed as and when we have our kind of future law reform.
I think where law reform is concerned, one of the things that we would want is the power to take action where some clinics are out of all proportion in relation to, say, multiple births to the general average. Now, what strikes me, I mean, I can understand the hesitancy about reducing the target and unintended consequences, but it's the question of whether it's still worth having a target at all. I mean, I realise there's option 4 coming up, and there'll be a discussion about that. But there seems something perverse to me about the HFEA having a target, which is a target is something to be aimed at of 10%, which the majority of clinics are, when the majority of clinics are under 5 or even 4%. There is something very perverse about that. And if we determine to continue it, we are saying that a 10% multiple birth rate is acceptable. That's the target that we've set. Now, that seems to me to undermine our very aim. And I can't see how that's acceptable to continue with that for a further period of time. I think there's something to be said for us as an authority to trust the clinics. They've changed their behaviour, the majority of them. There are some outliers. We've said that it wouldn't matter what the target was, there will always be some outliers, which persuades me to think that that's the reason why we need more powers to deal with the outliers in relation to good behaviour in relation to the clinics. So I don't see that there's a problem about abolishing the target now and replacing it with something that may look like option 4, because I think that would be a much more honest way of us saying, well, actually, this target has worked, it's been achieved, it's been exceeded, and we recognise that we've not got the powers to deal with the people who are the outliers, but that's why we need regulatory reform. So I think trusting the clinics may not be such a bad thing to do in this area, because they've already shown an enormous capacity to innovate and follow what the desire of this authority has been.
Rosamond and Steve and Alison, then we'll go to option 4.
A brief question, we might not know the answer. So one of the things we're discussing and is helpfully set out in the paperwork is the question of resources and the risk of duplication, etc. But do we have a real sense of how much duplication there would be? I mean, it might just be very difficult to answer, because, you know, we would be presumably we are proposing a certain set of regulatory reforms and powers, etc. How much of the resources, as it were, of a pot that might go into this piece of work would actually end up having to be respent if we do? Anyway, that there might not be, but it's just, I'm just noting that it is a kind of an assumption, and I'm sure a valid one, but I'm wondering how much is this the case that actually we would have to redo everything, some things, etc. Yeah, thank you.
So,
sorry, I was just going to say, I wish I could sort of give you a more satisfactory answer off the top of my head. I think something that I maybe mentioned in the paper or in the slides is, I think one of the benefits potentially of keeping the rate where it is now is we'd be able to perhaps look at the work again once we have a full perspective of, like you say, the details of what a new regulatory powers might be. So I think it is quite difficult. It's difficult for me at this stage to say exactly what that work might look like. So yeah, sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
Steve and then us.
Thank you. I think, as the Chair's mentioned already, there's absolutely nothing we can do about the clinics that don't want to comply at all. They have a different view on this, and without powers, we're not going to be able to change that. But I think if we do nothing and just continue with business as usual, then we're kind of ignoring the group of clinics that's sitting in the 6 to 10% group at the moment. Now, we've got the numbers of clinics in the data here, but I suspect that represents quite a lot of twin pregnancies. And those clinics are likely to be sitting there quite happily, following their multiple birth minimisation strategy. It's not really drawn to their attention during inspection because they're compliant with the 10% limit. So I actually very much like Francis's idea of doing something now to start to address the fact that target is going to need to come down. We know we can't enforce it, particularly on the clinics that aren't complying, but I think by sending that message out, it may make those clinics that have sat on their multiple birth minimisation strategy for probably several years now. I know they're supposed to look at it once a year and review it, as you are with all your documents, but I suspect it just sits there because they are under the 10% limit. So I think there is some merit in thinking and putting out a message that target is likely to come down.
Alison.
Thank you. It was just a point to note, really, that the strategy that was put in place wasn't just by the HFEA. It was a huge collaborative process with stakeholders and professional groups. And I think that's the first piece of work, is that you'd have to engage with stakeholders and professional groups to look at this question. And I would need to test the water with that option, because as I said, from the BFS, we're not looking at the single embryo transfer policy anymore, taking it off the table because it's been accepted as practice. So to go back to the stakeholder groups, we need to go back and ask them, would they be willing to work and look at this issue before taking any other decision, because it would be led as much by them. There's no point in imposing something onto a group that's hugely compliant for the sake of these 6 centres who are consistently high. This is not 6 different centres every year. This is 6 centres that are consistently high. Those between 6 and 8 or 6 and 10, certainly we could look at something, but I think we need to be mindful of jumping on the bandwagon of saying, let's reduce it to 3%, which is the same as the national acceptable twin rate. If you're not going to get buy-in from the centre, you've got buy-in from stakeholders at the moment to take it down to 4. If we start bandying about lower numbers, you might not get the buy-in, and then we might be in a worse position. One of the key issues for the centres that usually have the lowest multiple rate is because they are looking after the patients obstetrically. The centres that might, and this is just hearsay perhaps, but centres that do not look after their own patients obstetrically don't have the same reason to reduce the multiple rate. If they're only doing the embryo transfer, then they're leaving the country or moving back to where they live. So tying the 2 areas together is quite challenging as well. And I guess the centres that have got obstetric and gynae input are very mindful of multiple pregnancies because they'll hear it from their colleagues in the risk management strategies.
Should we just move? I think let's just move. I'm conscious of time, so we've got lots of time because it's an important thing. But let's move to option 4, and then we can bring it all together.
Thank you. So the 4th and final option is to change to an upper limit of either 10% or another lower figure, with the aim to shift the focus to centres with a multiple birth rate higher than the limit. This was another generally popular option with stakeholders. I'll say there's roughly equal support for options 3 and 4. But on the other hand, given our limited enforcement powers, it's unclear what action, if any, we'd be able to take for centres who might breach the limit. And in the same way as option 3, there's a discussion which we've been having about whether this is the right time to change in light of potential upcoming law reform. So all I have left to say is really thank you for your comments so far. I'd be grateful for your thoughts on this option, and then when you're ready, a decision on how best to move forward with this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'd be minded to accept a variant of this option, and that is everything we've discussed today has been about absolutes, and I just wonder if there's a relative option that we would take the national average and we would expect all clinics to be within a range of that national average that would be, 2 standard deviations above or below, or 3 standards deviations above or below. So in that way, the rate would be setting a national limit. It would negate, to an extent, some of Tim's issues that people might make a clinical decision to implant multiple embryos and be in that range. And you would then investigate outliers that were either very high and indeed very low for the off chance that clinically we have set of perverse incentives and people are making the wrong decisions to keep their rate down. So we would have a relative range and everyone would need to be in, the expected range. The only risk on this option is it might see the national average start to creep up again. So you would want to see some kind of backstop that if it got too high, we might think again. But while it's at an acceptable level, we are then just letting the sector set the limit, but we are using powers if people are either very high or indeed very low.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a question actually, because I think option 2 and option 4 could actually work a little bit together. But can we go to stakeholders and patient input and change the wording to that the 10% is an upper limit, not a target, as at least a starting point to change it? I don't know if we can do that.
Yeah, we can do whatever we want, really. I mean, so we could. Can I? Sorry, Tom.
Thank you. It was just again a quick clarification question. So I note in the option 1 it describes that most of the stakeholders didn't actually want that to continue, and you just said that both 3 and 4 had kind of broadly equal support. Who are the stakeholders that you consulted with?
Yeah, of course. So we went to our licensed centres panel. So we spoke to, that's PRs of a handful of clinics, more than a handful really. We went to our, see if I can get this right, it's our professional patient organisation stakeholder group, that's POSG, and then we've got PSG as well. So that, I mean, clues in the name. So it's our patient organisation, sort of representing patient interests, and then our professional stakeholder groups, such as professional bodies. So I spoke to those 3 groups separately with a range of options, very similar, although a little different to the ones that I presented to you today, and I sort of adjusted the options based on their feedback. Yeah, as I say, so broadly, options 3 and 4 had overall support, but there was, there were a few questions similar to ones that have been raised today about how any change would effectively address centres with a higher multiple birth rate without, with the limited enforcement powers that we have at the moment.
I really like Alex's suggestion. It would not require us to do a huge amount of work to work out what the new limit should be. We're effectively setting a range around what is already the established limit. And if we were allowed to identify clinics by name, you could have a graph with the standard deviation either side of the point, and you could plot and name those that fall outside the limit. So it would actually not create any extra work for us at all. I know we have no legislative power against those clinics at the moment, but effectively you would be identifying them at the very least.
Peter or Claire or Rachel, I mean, in terms of A, resource, and B, the idea of naming and shaming, which I must say I am very much in favour of, what's your sort of response, your view?
Why don't I go first and Rachel can add? So in a way, I mean, option 2 is kind of naming and shaming anyway, in the sense that once you no longer comment, on option 2, effectively, once you're effectively saying we're only going to report by exception, that's a version of naming and shaming. The mere fact, there's a question then about how publicly one names and shames, but if inspection is most minimum, if it's only mentioned in inspection reports where people are significantly over the target, that's a form of naming and shaming. So there's this variance of transparency. In terms of the broader, building on sort of Alex's version of option 4, I think there's the work itself to just do the numbers and see what that looks like, and you can play around with how many standard deviations you have to how wide a range you have, and that range, if you then mix that range against the annex, you'll get a sense of how many are in or outside of the range. That in itself is not an enormous piece of work. It seems to me there are 2 issues that follow from that. One of which, if you want to move forward with that, there's considerable engagement over what is a very different approach, because Alison and others are right. One of the great successes of this policy has been the extent to which there's been a general understanding and buy-in. So there's clearly work to do there. And then regardless of any of the options, it seems to me there's just this timing question, which is, you know, how much do you want to signal change and how much do you want to begin that change? And you know, you could regard this conversation as a direction of travel conversation, and then depending on the demands of what we've got over the business plan, we move forward at a faster or slower pace depending on resources. Or you could collectively conclude, no, this is terribly important and it's quite near the top of the queue, kind of thing. But I think those are the kind of options. But Claire or Rachel, is there anything you want to add to that?
I was just going to add, I chair the Licensed Centres Panel, which is made up of representatives from the sector. And I think it echoes what Tim said, that there was very much a feeling from those on there that this is routine, this is part of our everyday working now. We don't need a target because it's just the way that we work. So I think that does fall into it. And they were quite disgruntled, obviously, about those clinics that had much higher rates, and frustrated as much as we were that we couldn't do anything about. So I think whatever decision we make, we have to think about it being routine, think about what clinics are doing on a day-to-day basis, and they don't need that target to work to, but also what our inspectorate can do about it when it is high at the moment, because there is very limited what we can do. We can look at multiple birth minimisation strategies, because that's in the directions we can ask clinics to show it to us, but we can't actually particularly do anything about the actual target, and that's something that we need to think about in the future, but also make a building block perhaps to where we get there.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask you, if we looked at option 4, because we might want to look at putting together 2 options, changing the target to an upper limit, which is sort of more serious, if you like, than a target, and perhaps in a world where there has been law reform, you could then use that, as a sort of an incentive for those clinics that are above it. How difficult it is to change a target to an upper limit in terms of resource? Would we need the same level of consulting and so on?
I think the key thing is seeing this not as a sort of stage you need to go through, but what's your objective? The reason to consult is to develop a consensus about the way forward. That's been the great success of the policy. So it's less about, is this technically a tricky step, or do you have to go through, you have to give it so many weeks or something? It's rather, the virtue of a target is it's embedded, it's simple, it's got consensus. If the target is 10%, then it becomes 8% or something other. Frankly, the communications exercise, whatever the merits of the choice, is pretty easy because it's all of a piece. What variants of what we're suggesting outside of just keeping things are or lowering the target is thinking about the problem in a different way round. So I think the issue about engagement is about how do you build a consensus around an understanding of why you're doing different and what the objective is, which goes back to things like Zainab mentioned, are we interested in bringing the outliers in, and so on. So
yeah, and then I'll answer Peter. You go.
I think it's quite interesting to hear that, you had equal support for 3 and 4. And I was really appreciative you asked who the stakeholders were, because that's what I was thinking as well. And I think it's really important to consult the stakeholders, but with certain decisions, we might weight the opinions of certain groups over others. And I think here, this is the clinic's work. This is what clinics do day in and day out. So it's quite important how they think about it. And I think where we don't have a clear consensus, and we have these different opinions, just moving to do something, because it seems like the 10% has become a bit redundant, everybody's falling underneath it, could really risk taking something that's currently a big success story for the HFEA and turning it into something that's really not a success story. And I think that might be something we have to think about as a potential con as well. Just because this has worked well, I don't really see how that suggests that we should do something about it. For me, it really, everything points to not doing much about it.
So,
Francis, come. I wonder if I'm just slightly misunderstanding something, but we have a target rate of 10%. If we said we want the upper limit to be 10%, aren't we effectively slightly reducing the target rate, but without having to specify an alternative figure? So there's not really very much difference for the clinics that are complying. It's almost a question of semantics. I agree. I mean, I think we can't solve two separate problems in one way. And it may be that addressing the serious outliers is something that we can't do with much effect until there is law reform. But I don't think we should keep saying, you know, the world will all suddenly be better when we move house, because there are things that we could change now that might be helpful.
Yeah, I just think, to a Tony point, if there was an upper limit and we didn't go for a relative approach, I would ask the question not to be answered now about whether there needs to be a lower limit, because it strikes me 0 might not be a good answer. Exactly.
I think that all the discussion that we've had, the key thing that everyone is very keen on is the 6 clinics that are the major outliers, that they're the ones that need to be targeted. And I think the option 2, which I think has been succinctly put as name and shame, is a big step forward, because those are the clinics that then people can identify, and hopefully it may not enable some communication and discussion that might lead to better outcomes. Combining it with an upper limit might also be helpful, because an upper limit is more of a ceiling. A target at the moment is if it's 11-12%, is that okay? Because it should be 10. If it's an upper limit, again, that adds to the reporting that can be picked up quite clearly. If it's above 10, it's hit the limit, and it can be reported on the HFEA website and inspection reports, and highlight those clinics that have reached the 10. I've no doubt we will revisit this. It's just timing of when.
Tim.
I mean, I think, again, we need to bear in mind that with 52% of the clinics under 4% multiple birth rate, that's not because of a 10% target. That's not because of anything the HFEA is actively doing at the moment. This is just what's happening in the sector across the world. So absolutely, we started the ball rolling in this in the UK, but it was also happening in other countries. And I've just checked the HFEA data across Europe, and it's been the same model, same line going down as well. So I think, just following on from particularly what Alison said, if we were to choose a lower figure, I think an issue with the 2 or 3 standard deviations is, I mean, the amount of the data points here is so large, the standard deviations are going to be tiny. So you're going to be pretty, very close to sort of choosing 4% or saying 4% plus an arbitrary 2 or 3% on top. I think it's going to be quite a difficult approach. My view would be the sector is doing this anyway. Us lowering it down to 5%, I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference, because it's happening anyway, and we have no bite. And as I said before, clinics are going to say, well, so what? Surely you guys should be discussing the high clinics, not everyone else at the moment. So my view would be having an expected range. So I agree, it is only semantics perhaps. I'm aware of the amount of work, both for us, the HFEA, and also trying to engage with the sector to actually come up with a fixed figure, a lower figure, when we can't do anything about it anyway. So my view would be to have a normal range, so which is option 4, but then to really focus on naming and shaming, which I guess is an option 2. So a blend of those two.
Anya, and then Geeta.
Yeah, I just think one of the flip sides of the name and shame is that potentially we've got an opportunity to celebrate the messaging that has worked, and to really report good practice, re-emphasize why it's happened. But I do like to think that hopefully the culture shift is a permanent one. It certainly looks like it is, and so there is an element of trust, I think, with the clinics. But just as we're sort of highlighting what could be done better, I think there's such a good news story here that it's worth celebrating that as well.
Geeta?
Thank Thank you, Julia. Now, this is an excellent discussion. I think this sector has moved towards reducing it. The main thing has come from the HFEA. And on the back of what the HFEA did with the target, the NHS acted. The NHS took that on board and said, for contracts, you've got to follow this. And therefore, single embryo transfer is mandatory for those who have an NHS contract. So in some ways, the centres that are doing this are those who have NHS contracts or NHS units. Plus, as Alison said, those who meet obstetricians and fetal medicine specialists in the corridors or in MDTs and who say, oh my God, what's going on here with this IVF, multiple pregnancies. So I think it has worked. It has increased NHS funding. It has made it safer. And I just still think target is the right word because we work with targets in health service. It's quite common for us using the word target. So, I mean, Alex brought up something very interesting. So I would just leave it as still, is this the time to do more work about where we should be with the reduced number?
Hi, thank you. So just to nail my colours to the mast a little bit, I think I would support option 2 as a definite, and then in addition we look at the other sort of options as well. So I think that there's something about that. I'd also suggest that a lot of the conversation has been around sort of where we want the impact, but also we want to celebrate this. So I would just question, is there a way to particularly provide an incentive for those that are hitting that lower amount by recognition that that is best practice, so that there is a recognition that that area is a sort of something to aim for, might be something to fit into that. And I would probably go for changing the target to an upper limit, but potentially have some things within that, because upper doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you can say within there. And finally, there is a bit about sort of timing and resources, but I do think that there's things that we could do now, but there's also things where we could do wider engagement that might signal things to the wider set of community to get consensus, and that may be the longer term solution to this.
Thank you. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and it absolutely vindicates to me the importance of a really diverse set of experiences, backgrounds and views on a topic that's of such importance. I think my overall position is that, subject to a caveat around the need for further consideration of comms options and using our voice both to name and shame the outliers that we want to target, but also to celebrate best practice and flag the reason for the one at a time, i.e. the risks associated with mothers and babies and the NHS of multiple births. For those reasons, I would support option 2 as an interim or as a holding measure. It draws attention to those few clinics above 10%, so that's consistent with our new strategic theme of patient protection. Modest resource to change templates and processes. It's proportionate and financially prudent, in my view, given the absence of any powers to enforce compliance with the target. And I also think that there's a compelling rationale in it for the stakeholders who, broadly speaking, want change. So I think we avoid the danger of reputational loss, either that the regulator is out of touch with trends in the sector, or complacent. And then I think longer term, if and when we have the powers to enforce compliance, my view would be that we need to explore both option 3 and 4 in the amended form that Alex argued more fully. My gut steer is in favour of a move to an upper limit. But on the question of whether or not it warrants spending further resource now on identifying either a lower target or a lower upper limit, I don't believe that we can justify that now. And I think my main argument is that were we to do that, we'd be accused of being Canute. You know, we are currently impotent. So standing and flagging that we'd like to reduce the target, but with no powers to do anything about enforcing it, would frankly reduce our standing and our authority as the regulator. So for all those reasons, I'm in support of option 2 as a holding measure, and then longer term, as soon as I hope if and when we have the powers to move to considering 3 and 4 again.
So would it help if I just tried to bring all this to a close? Not sure, or at least to see where I think my starting point from this is, what do we want to achieve really? And I think the starting point for the whole one at a time policy was to achieve, you know, a safer regime for patient women and babies, and that still has to be the central core. And it's worked very well because the majority of our clinics are abiding by that and have that safety at their core. But I think, and I'm very, you know, I take Tim's point that, and Zainab also, that you know, the sector has responded very well to this regime, and the results are spectacular, and we should celebrate it. And what we really don't want to do is to sort of, if you like, irritate unnecessarily the sector by burdening them with something that actually they're already doing, and trying to you know, perhaps even over-regulate them, particularly since I think in the last few years the relationship with the sector has got a lot better and it's a lot more collaborative. And you know, we don't want to bash them for something they're not doing. However, you know, we have a significant number of outliers in this. It's not that it's just 1 or 2 clinics. So that's one thing. And secondly, because Graham and others mentioned, you know, it looks a little bit daft, on the other hand, to have a target which is now meaningless because so many clinics have achieved it and well below it. But it's not quite meaningless because there are still a significant number of clinics really who 15% who are above that target. But then I feel whatever the target was, they're just going to thumb their nose at us because they can, because we have no powers to do anything about it. So what do we want the outcome to be in a way? I think what we want to do is we want to emphasize the importance of the target, i.e. patient safety, patient and baby safety at the core. And therefore having a much reduced target is a really good way of doing that, by saying, okay, well, you know, you've done well, but actually we can do even better, and that will make life even safer for patients and babies. We could do that. But as Catherine pointed out, as others, you know, that requires, you know, a significant amount of time and resource at a time now when we really, you know, it might stop us doing other work that is perhaps more urgent. I'm not saying it's more important, but given that it's working pretty well, we need to be very careful about diverting resource from other projects. And we've also got law reform, which I know may take a long while, but in the next few months, look, we've got proposals already at the department. You know, we will probably know in the next few months a likely or a possible target for that. And therefore, then what we don't want to do is change something where, you know, to do all the work to change it to 5% and we don't really have any teeth. Whereas once if we know that we've got a programme of law reform, we can start then mapping out a timetable which will include perhaps a revised target. And in fact, I think will actually help concentrate the minds of those in the outliers in the sector. Because if we, at the point we're able to go to them and saying, well, look, you know, next year or two, we may well have these powers. It's likely that we are, and boy, are we going to come up. We can come after you. You know, that's quite a persuasive argument. In the meantime, I'm also think that from what I'm hearing from everybody, and I completely agree with, is one of the reasons for lowering the target is not to let these outliers off the hook. Although lowering the target at the moment, we don't think will do anything to them. But not letting them off the hook seems to me a good result, because whereas all the other clinics that are well below the 10%, their clinicians are making decisions every day around patient safety, baby safety, and so on. And so we sort of trust them, as Anya says. We don't really have to worry about them. It'd be nice to have a lower target, but we don't have to worry about them. What we really have to worry about is the 15% or so who are just flagrantly ignoring us, and actually therefore compromising patient and baby safety. So perhaps what I'm hearing, and obviously we have to vote on it, but what I'm thinking I'm hearing from you all is that if we, as a first off, adopted option 2, so we left the rate for now at 10%, and however we looked at the possibility of reporting this differently, so we are, quote, naming and shaming in whatever way that is, so that those clinics which are above the 10%, we know who they are, and patients know who they are, because that's the more important thing. We perhaps look at how much work would be needed, which may be minimal, to change the target to an upper limit, which is adopting 4. So we sort of have our artillery in a row before law reform, because if we have an upper limit, not a target, at that point we can use any powers that we might get later on, to say you've breached the upper limit, which is more serious, but also to reduce the upper limit well down at the time when we've got the resource to do so and we know we've got the powers. That doesn't mean to say I think we ignore reducing the rate or the upper limit, but perhaps from what I'm hearing, if we adopted sort of 2 and 4 now, but perhaps then towards the end of the year, so look at our business plan, look at how we're doing, and try to get some idea and ask the exec to have some idea, say in next year, about could we actually look at this as a piece of work, or could we revisit this and see if we maybe needed then to do a larger piece of work to reduce what is either a target or an upper limit. So, it's a compromise. It doesn't take it off the table, but it sort of has a solution. There's a short-term solution, and there's perhaps a short-term fix, long-term solution. Yeah.
With the new proposed reporting under option 2, would that mean that clinics whose rates are like very low, let's say 2%, that wouldn't be highlighted? Might that seem as a bit of a disincentive, or is that not on it at the moment?
I'm not sure if it's on at the moment. I would put them all in.
That's what it's currently.
No, the assumption on 2 is we turn our public attention to those who are above the target, rather than routinely reporting, people who are below it. So it's banking, if you like. And I take all the comments that people have made about good comms about success and so on. It's banking the success and sort of throwing our regulatory effort. And most of that will be in the publicity area. Is focusing on those who are above.
But I'm just wondering if the clinics who've worked really hard to get their rate really low down might just feel like they're not getting the attention they deserve, whether that might be.
In a way, then don't like the option. You know what I mean? 2 is explicitly about moving to a regime where the regulatory effort is on those who miss rather than those who achieve. I take your point, but that's at its core.
Rachel, do you want to come in there?
Just on that, we do need to think about how we report at inspection anyway, because we report on exception. We report on things that are non-compliant or we have concerns about, and that's how we genuinely report. So I think this actually fits in more in line with how we inspect and report anyway.
I think the clinics that are doing well because that's their clinical ethos, that this is what should be done. And perhaps I'm doing a misjudgment to some clinics who are working very hard, but it's been around for such a long time, it should be well built into clinical practice. And I think Tim's alluded to that these decisions are made quite soundly, which is why we've got where we are. So I don't think the sectors will be penalised in any way.
I think also Peter's point about banking success, it's you don't want to be on the list. You don't mind if you're not on the list, in fact, because if we start reporting those who are over the target, then everybody else, of course, is clearly under. So, great.
I mean, thank you, Julia. I'd happily buy into your proposals. The only thing I wonder about, Annabelle's already done quite a lot of work with stakeholders, and one of the things that is here is that the majority of stakeholders obviously expect some change, don't they? That's the import of your paper, really. And what I would hope is that we might give some signal that change is coming, so that it's not, what makes me anxious is that we've had this discussion here, but it then looks as if we really feel powerless to do anything, so nothing is happening at all. And it's whether the proposal that you make is signalled, fairly quickly rather than at the end of the year.
Well, I sort of hadn't quite finished it because, you're exactly right. But what I was going to say was that we could now, if we accept 2 and 4, and as I suggested, we revisit this towards the end of the year. It might be part of our away day discussions in November, for example, we could revisit it. And as I also just mentioned before, I think it would be very useful for the exec to go away and do a piece of work. I mean, not a piece, to think about what work would be needed, how it would work, the time frame and so on. Because I think, we talk about this it will be a lot of resource and it will take time, and I think it all will, but I'd quite like to know what that actually looks in a bit more detail. And if we could revisit that, we could actually now signal to the sector that we are doing this now, but we are later in the year, and in tandem perhaps with our proposals for law reform, depending on how that timetable works, considering, setting a new target or a new rate or whatever. Because I think that answers that answers the concern of the sector that we need to do something, or stakeholders that we need to do something. But it also, I think, goes to Tim's point that the sector feel they're managing it largely very well by themselves. So we're not just rushing in for the sake of it, So I it's a compromise, and we obviously will vote on the options, but it feels to me that it's sort of a manageable compromise. So, comments, Peter?
Well, you convinced me, Julia, about this 2-step approach about what to be done now, and also signal. Just a question to you, Annabelle. When we took stakeholders' opinions, did we include any obstetricians, neonatologists, or any fetal medicine specialists as part of stakeholders, because they are the ones who see these problems, and not fertility specialists?
There we go. To be honest, I'm trying to think off the top of my head who have what specialisms. I don't know if you would know.
Page 69, the stakeholder groups. Page 69, 2. Licensed centre plans, I suspect no
We better put our mics on if we're talking, because the online people can't hear.
Sorry, I think that the licensed centre panel, if there's any obstetricians or gynecologists, they're also fertility specialists. I don't think they're on there with that specific hat. So I suspect that we didn't have any neonatologists or obstetricians or gynecologists there. I don't think we had the first time round either.
To be fair, Jane Denton, who's leading in this area, is on both the professional and patient organisation stakeholder group, representing the Multiple Births Foundation. So I don't want to misrepresent her opinion, because I think she was strongly of the view, if I remember rightly, that the target should be lowered for for obvious reasons from the people she represents.
We are out of time. Oh, really? Come on, Alex.
Sorry, I was just going to say I would just urge again in any further work on option 4, relative rates are considered as well as absolute.
Good idea. We heard that. It's good. All right, look, we're out of time. Actually, unusually, we're even going to be late. I've never had a meeting that's run on late, given we were 45 minutes early about a few minutes ago. This has been a great discussion. Shall we just look at this and say, can I ask, who is in favour? And you just raise your hands. Or Tim, raise your hand. Yes, on 1, anybody in favour of BAU, keeping this as it is? No. Who would be in favour of option 2 for the moment? That's a fair number, yeah. Who would be in favour of option 3 to do it now? Okay, yeah, that's fine. And who would be in favour of option 4? And I think we are talking in conjunction with option 2, but yeah. So who would be in charge? Who would be in favour of option 4 on its own? And who would be in favour in option 2, option 4 in conjunction with option 2?
Meet sequentially.
Yeah. I mean sequentially. And can I just give a third one, just because I think it reflects our discussion? Who would be in favour of then, some idea from the exec, perhaps at the November meeting, of the resources and so on it would require to do option 3, and then perhaps a short discussion about should we do some work on option 3 at some stage, in 2026 or 27. Yeah. So I think that's enough. Okay. Thank you. And Annabelle, thank you very, very much indeed. That was not easy for you, and you did a great job. All right, very quickly, as you will remember, we did a very positive, we did a public bodies review, which was quite a torturous process. But luckily we came out of it very positively. There were a number of recommendations, 15 or something I remember, that we agreed to do. And I think this is, we just asked Claire to update us on the progress, but also I think that the updates, further updates are really just business as usual. And this was a standing order, a standing item, but I think we can take it off now. So I'm just going to ask Claire to run us through that quickly.
I'm disappointed that you don't want me to run line by line through all the recommendations, but there's not a huge amount more to say. I suppose just to add that this was also a standing item on the quarterly accountability that we have with our sponsor team at the department, but that has also now been dropped as no longer needed. So really, unless there are any questions on any of the particular recommendations that came out of the public bodies review and our response, there are several that are still ongoing, but most of those would come through AGC discussions on post-PRISM developments. And there's also a couple that would come through SCAT consideration of future data collection recommendations back to the HFEA. I think, yeah, those are the only two that I particularly wanted to say are still outstanding.
So we're all happy for that to go into BAU and not really trouble us again? I think so. Okay. So thank you. AOB, anybody? So I have two very quick things. The first is a hello, and that is to welcome Sophie Thury, who is our new head of governance. So hopefully that has been an interesting first meeting for you, although I think you did observe the last one. And also, I can't believe I'm saying this, a goodbye, because this is Paula Robinson's last authority meeting before she retires. When I asked various people how long Paula had been with the organisation, been with the authority. Somebody said, well, I think it's more than 15 years, and nobody could quite remember because it's been so long that Paula is really, I wouldn't say part of the furniture, but very embedded in the authority. But just because somebody's been at an organisation for a long time doesn't mean that actually, you know, perhaps when they leave, there's a little bit of a sigh of relief that they are going off to do something a little more appropriate for them. The same could not be said of Paula. We're probably making 3 new appointments to cover what she does. But in truth, nobody can really cover what she does because her, you know, commitment, her experience, the help she has certainly given me over the last 4 years, let alone everybody else over many, many years, has been really second to none. And although I hope she has a wonderful retirement when she finally moves to Wales, I honestly don't know what we're going to do without you. And I think I can only just say thank you so much. We've been really, really lucky to have you. And I just hope you have a wonderful retirement because you deserve it. And I just hope you have, you can only move somewhere with good phone signal because we will definitely need to keep in touch.
To answer your original question, Julia, my first meeting was January 2007, and it was in the gloomy windowless basement room in Bloomsbury Street. The subject of the day was hybrids and chimera, if I'm pronouncing it right now. And it was a really complicated, impressive discussion for a new person coming in. And I've worked with a lot of boards, and I realised I was seeing the very best in action, because the nature of the discussion was really complex. And I remember being so impressed at the calibre of the discussion that the members were having. And you've done it again today. You've had another really complicated one. And honestly, I really want to thank all of you, not just for the way that you've been in meetings, but also for all the support that you've given to me and my team in between meetings as well. And all the tough stuff we've done through the committees, which the public don't see and don't know so much about. But there's a lot of work there that you do. And you've always been great to work with, absolutely brilliant. And I've always loved my time at the HFEA, and I'll look back on it very fondly. And I will be in touch, and I will miss you all. But I leave you in very good hands.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay, so everybody, thank you all for coming, and we'll continue in there.